You already know the name. You have heard it before, maybe in a documentary, maybe in a podcast playing through your earbuds at 2 in the morning when you probably should have stopped. The name stuck, and you are not sure why. That is not a coincidence. That is not a flaw in your character. That is something far older, far stranger, and far more revealing about what your brain actually is. Because here is what nobody tells you when they hand you the crime statistics or the psychological profiles or the grainy courtroom footage. Serial killers do not just follow a pattern. They follow the exact same pattern. Across cultures, across centuries, across continents that have never shared a language. And the reason they do has almost nothing to do with the killer. It has everything to do with you. Let us start at the beginning. In 1978, FBI agent Robert Ressler sat across a table from a man who had murdered at least 6 people. Ressler was not there to prosecute him. He was there to listen. What came out of those interviews, and dozens more that followed, became the foundation of the FBI's behavioral science unit, and eventually a framework that criminologists still use today. Ressler called it criminal profiling, but what he had actually discovered was something closer to a behavioral algorithm, a loop, a sequence that repeated itself with unsettling regularity, regardless of who the killer was or where they came from. The loop looked like this: a fantasy phase, a planning phase, a cooling off phase, and a return, over and over again. Why a loop? Why not chaos? Why not randomness? The answer takes you somewhere you probably did not expect. Your brain is a prediction engine. That is not a metaphor. Neuroscientist Carl Friston has spent decades arguing that the brain's primary job is not to perceive the world, but to predict it, constantly generating models of what it expects to happen next, and then updating those models when reality disagrees. You do not see the chair in front of you so much as you predict it is there, and then confirm the prediction with your eyes. This is called the predictive processing framework, and it has reshaped how neuroscientists think about almost everything, including violence. A brain wired to predict is also a brain that can run simulations. It can imagine futures before they exist. It can rehearse outcomes. It can replay memories and edit them. Every human brain does this. You do this right now, every time you imagine how a conversation might go before you have it, every time you picture a room before you walk into it. In most people, this simulation capacity is directed at ordinary things: plans, conversations, problems, meals. In a small number of people, something goes wrong with the filtering system that decides what the simulation should be about. Psychologist James Malloy, one of the foremost researchers on predatory violence, describes this as a shift from affiliative fantasy to predatory fantasy. Affiliative fantasy is normal. It is the mind rehearsing connection, achievement, belonging. Predatory fantasy is the mind rehearsing control, domination, the elimination of a perceived threat or an obstacle to an imagined state. And the key word there is imagine. The threat is not always real. The obstacle is not always real. But the brain that has crossed into predatory simulation treats the fantasy as a problem that needs solving. This is why the pattern starts with the fantasy phase. The mind has been running a loop it cannot stop. The simulation has become compulsive. And a compulsive simulation, Malloy argues, creates the same cognitive hunger as any other compulsion. It demands to be resolved. So the planning begins, and here is where it gets stranger. Because the planning phase does not look like what you think it looks like. It is not frantic. It is not disorganized. It is methodical. It is careful. It often involves significant intelligence applied to logistics in a way that observers later describe as chilling. And the reason is simple. The brain that has been running a fantasy for months or years has already solved most of the logistical problems in simulation. The actual planning is almost an afterthought. The groundwork was laid in the mind long before any physical action was taken. Robert Hare, the Canadian psychologist who developed the psychopathy checklist, found something that surprised even him in his decades of research. The individuals who scored highest on his measure of psychopathy were not simply indifferent to consequences. They were often acutely aware of consequences and simply applied a different weighting to them. Future harm to others registered as close to 0. Immediate resolution of the internal compulsive loop registered as extremely high. The calculation was not broken. The inputs were. Now pause, because this is where the story turns. None of this explains why you are drawn to it. You are not a predatory mind. You are not running compulsive loops about domination. And yet here you are, aware of the name, aware of the case, aware of the pattern, possibly having spent hours reading about it. The true crime industry generates billions of dollars per year. Podcasts, documentaries, books, dramatizations. The demand is not a niche curiosity. It is a mass phenomenon. And it is not explained by pathology. It is explained by the same predictive brain that produces the violence in the first place. Here is what researchers believe is happening. Your brain is doing what it always does, running simulations. But now it is running a different kind. It is modeling the predatory mind from the outside. It is building a map of a type of threat so that the threat can be recognized, predicted, and avoided. This is called the threat simulation theory of mind, and it was first proposed by Finnish psychologist Antti Revonsuo in 2000. Revonsuo argued that the brain rehearses threatening scenarios during sleep in the form of nightmares, precisely because rehearsing threats improves survival. The same principle, researchers now believe, extends to waking fascination with danger, crime, and predatory violence. You are not fascinated because you are broken. You are fascinated because you are working. Your brain is extracting a pattern from the story of a predatory mind. It is mapping the warning signs, the escalation, the behavioral tells, the overlooked moments where the loop became visible and nobody named it. It is doing this because somewhere in evolutionary history, the individuals who could recognize the behavioral signature of a dangerous person before that person acted survived at a higher rate than those who could not. The true crime audience is overwhelmingly female. This is documented. The theories about why are numerous, but one that holds significant weight is straightforwardly Darwinian. In most human societies across most of recorded history, women have faced significantly higher risk from predatory interpersonal violence than men. A brain that models predatory patterns in extreme detail is a brain that has an edge. The fascination is not morbid curiosity. It is a survival system running at full capacity. And now you see why the pattern matters on both sides. The killer follows a pattern because a broken simulation engine demands resolution and keeps returning to the same loop until something stops it. The audience follows the pattern because a healthy simulation engine is extracting threat data from the story and storing it as something resembling a map. Two minds, two loops, both following the same compulsive logic, one running toward, one modeling from a safe distance. Criminologist David Cantor, who pioneered the field of investigative psychology in the United Kingdom, spent decades building what he called the smallest space analysis of criminal behavior. His central finding was this: offenders are consistent, not just in method, in geography, in timing, in victim selection, in the seemingly irrelevant behavioral details that leak from the fantasy into the physical world. The pattern is not something investigators impose on the data. The pattern is what the data produces. Because the mind that generates the behavior has been generating the same simulation for so long that its fingerprints are everywhere. Cantor argued that understanding the pattern was less about the killer and more about the underlying cognitive architecture that makes any human mind capable of sustained, organized, goal-directed behavior. That architecture is the same one you are using right now to follow this story, to track the argument, to anticipate where it is going. The mechanism is shared. The direction is the opposite. There is a final piece of this. After the event, in the cooling off phase, something specific happens in the predatory mind that does not happen in ordinary violence. There is a dissatisfaction. The resolution of the compulsive loop does not hold. The fantasy does not match the reality. The simulation cannot be satisfied because the simulation was never about the external event. It was about an internal state that the external event could not actually change. And so the loop resets. The fantasy begins again. The pattern returns. This is why the cooling off phase exists. This is why there is always a return. The brain that runs a broken simulation cannot be satisfied by the world because it is not looking for something in the world. It is trying to resolve something inside itself that the world does not contain. And here is the thing about you sitting with this. At whatever hour it is, in whatever room you are in, you already knew that feeling. Not the violence, not the predation, but the loop that will not resolve, the thought that keeps returning, the simulation that runs without your permission. Every human mind has a version of it. The difference is in the direction the loop points and the filtering system that decides what it reaches for. You heard the name. It's stuck. And now you understand why. That is not something dark inside you. That is a very old, very functional system doing exactly what it was built to do. Recognize the shape of a predator before the predator acts, store it, and carry it forward. You heard the name, and somewhere in your brain, a map got updated.